Last night I went to the early access screening of Maxxxine and walked out of the theater confident in saying that Ti West has crafted not only one of the best horror trilogies in recent memory, but one of the greatest horror trilogies of all time. Here's my thoughts on the latest film. In Ti West's latest horror offering, Maxxxine, we are transported to 1980s Hollywood, where adult film star and aspiring actress Maxine Minx, played incredibly once again by Mia Goth, finally gets her big break. However, as a mysterious killer begins stalking the starlets of Hollywood, a trail of blood threatens to uncover Maxine's sinister past. Maxxine is, of course, the third entry in Ti West's X franchise, with Pearl taking place in 1918 as a prequel to X, which is set in 1979, and this film takes place in the 1980s. And I'll be honest, that was one of the things that made me most nervous entering into this film in particular from the first trailer, was that I knew it was going to be set in the 1980s, and especially because of the fact that Stranger Things, a little show you may have heard of, did for the 80s what Walking Dead did for zombies. It created this boom and this interest where every property, every studio was pushing for things that were set around that premise. So in the wake of Walking Dead, we saw a huge outflow of zombie media, video games, books, to the point where zombie fatigue became very real. We're seeing that with superheroes right now. And I think we saw that really in the wake of Stranger Things, where a lot of films were being set in the 1980s time period. It's certainly the reason I think certain films came out around the time they did. I think of movies like It, that definitely I think it helped it get greenlit, even though it was a Stephen King property. I think the timing of Stranger Things, even borrowing a cast member, really helped that movie get off the ground. And even big superhero movies like, of course, Wonder Woman 1984 really leaned into the 80s aesthetic. But unfortunately, the reason I'm really tired of the 1980s aesthetic coming into modern media is that it is very much a party city version of the 1980s. I was not born in the 1980s, but I've watched a lot of cinema from that time period. And while there's certainly the big poofy-haired 80s movies, there was also the gritty, nasty underbelly of the 80s that existed. You had the idealism of the 80s, and then you had like this kind of grimy, seedy, version of the 1980s that gets lost in a lot of media. Particularly, going back to Wonder Woman 1984, that movie just feels like a Gap commercial from the 80s. It doesn't feel grounded in any sense of reality. And I know some of that was an intentional stylistic choice, but it's not one that particularly worked for me because I like the nastiness of the 1980s in those movies. I think of films like Death Wish, Savage Streets, Hardcore, which came out in 1979, but Ti West mentioned had a big impact on the look and feel of this film. That's not to say there isn't the big poofy hair and the neon colors and all that in this movie, but it balances it out. And Ti West even said in an interview recently that...
So for me, it was more about like an era and a vibe. There are certain movies that I wouldn't say the movie or the story was necessarily a direct reference or anything like that, but for me, like to recreate the kind of grimier side of Hollywood is something that hadn't been done in a while. I've always really liked that aesthetic and liked seeing the sort of glamour of Hollywood and then the sort of underbelly of Hollywood. But
I'm happy to say my fears about Maxine were put to rest very quickly. We open with a very incredible performance from Mia Goth right out of the gate, where she delivers almost a mini version of the Pearl monologue in a totally different format and setting, but with the same power and intensity. And then we go into this kind of 80s montage intro sequence, which kind of tells you exactly what version of the 1980s the movie's going to get. It's still stylized. It's still a little bit heightened at times, but it definitely has that grit and that grime that I just love about movies of that period. So the setting really, really worked for me. The movie follows, of course, Mia Goth as Maxine Minx. Mia Goth, I could sing her praises forever and ever. I love her in this series, but I think she's one of the greatest gifts to movies in a really, really long time. I love her other films like High Life. I even love movies like Cure for Wellness, which I think is an underrated gem. And I think she's absolutely phenomenal and gives one of her best performances so far in the movie Infinity Pool. But there's no doubt saying that Maxine is definitely the biggest character that audiences know her for. And it's with good reason. It's a fascinating, fascinating character. And what I really love about Maxine's character in this movie is that we get to see the part where most horror movies end. Like Friday the 13th, we have characters that go through severe amounts of trauma. And then the movie will end with a crane shot of ambulances leaving the camp. And it kind of leaves this ambiguity about, well, what next? They just face something harrowing. They usually ended up having to commit a gruesome act against this killer and made them question, things about themselves. And you never get to see what happens next and what happens to the final girl after the credits roll of the previous movie. But with this, we really get to see this. We get to see Mia Goth in these moments as Maxine in isolation, where she is having these flashbacks to the events of X, where she is grappling with the reality that she did some things that she never pictured herself doing. And I think those are the most compelling pieces of this movie. Again, there's a lot of fun, sets and designs, but it's the moments where she's grappling with those things internally, and you can see that on her face. You can see this kind of sense of feeling tired and carrying this weight of things that happened in the prior movie that, again, I think could have been just a quick flashback sequence in the beginning of the movie, but I think it helps in the pacing of the movie that they're kind of sprinkled throughout. So you can see this kind of journey mentally that Maxine is going on beneath the very visually interesting exterior and the character the real character she's become in the Hollywood scene. But Mia Goth's not the only performance here that shines. I mean, everybody in the cast brings their A game. I could give a special shout out to every single one. I'm not going to because it's a big cast, but a couple standouts for me were Elizabeth Debicki, who plays the director of Puritan 2 in the movie. I thought was really great. Moses Sumney was a standout for me. He plays Maxine's friend that works in the video store, and the handful of scenes where they're just kind of talking, hanging out really feels like the hangout movies that I like in the 1980s, where you have these kind of quirky side characters that are also really important to the main character. And I thought he just lit up the screen in every scene he was in. Giancarlo Esposito, when I saw him in the trailer, I thought we were going to get Gustavo Fring 2.0 because, again, typecasting is a real thing. And I think a lot of times when he's cast in things like even The Mandalorian, he plays just a very villainous, character that's just very monotone, and he's extremely comedic and gets to flex a different set of muscles in this. Kevin Bacon is delightfully nasty. And Bobby Cannavale, who I first noticed in The Other Guys, who plays a cop in this movie and plays a cop in that movie as well, is great. But as wonderful as the cast are in front of the camera, the crew behind the camera is great as well. Elliot Rocket, who I've actually had on this show and interviewed about Pearl and X before, did a really good job. Again, I've talked about a couple of these different actors getting to flex their muscles. Ty West is flexing in this movie. Elliot Rocket is flexing in this movie. And Elliot's really had an interesting journey in this because he's gotten to flex his muscles in cinematic style that spans literally decades now. You've got the Texas Chainsaw aesthetic that you have in X. You've got this kind of Technicolor Wizard of Oz palette in Pearl. And now you've got this very Goodfellas-esque kind of cinematography in Maxine. I found myself thinking about that movie a lot throughout the course of the film, especially the tracking shot. There's a tracking shot in the beginning following Mia Goth through this club. And it was just another level of filmmaking. And it was really cool to see the production design in this. I mean, I have to imagine cost a pretty penny, but money well spent and well photographed. Particularly the final shot, which I won't give away, is mind-blowing. Of course, you can't have a movie set in the 80s without some incredible needle drops, and all I'll say is that it's a great soundtrack and great original score from Tyler Bates as well, who scored X and Pearl. Again, flexing his muscles as an artist and giving us something really unique and powerful. And then, of course, the soundtrack takes some 80s songs that, yes, set us in the era, but also takes some that are at face value are just a song that reminds us of the 80s, but also when contrasted with the things that are happening, take on a much more dark and sinister undertone, particularly, again, the final closing song that leads us into the credits. My personal take on Maxine is that it's fantastic, and I would have a hard time picking out of X, Pearl, and Maxine. I just rewatched X and Pearl, and basically every time I watch one of those movies, I go back and forth on which one's my favorite because I enjoy both so much. And I think I'll have the same problem with Maxine. I walked out of the theater going, this might be my favorite of this series, but I think all three do something so unique with these threads that also carry through where there's something to love in each one. And it really is a beautiful, fantastic trilogy, not just as a horror trilogy, but a trilogy in general. It's an all-time great, in my opinion, and I absolutely loved it. In terms of things that I think people might struggle with in this movie, I think the biggest complaints I've just seen echoed have been that the movie is big. There's a lot of threads and moving parts, which is certainly true, but it worked for me. And some people may have issue with the way that the film ends. I saw a couple reviews on Letterboxd saying that the ending was messy, or it went too big, or or didn't go big enough, and like all those sorts of things. I'll just say, without any spoilers, I think the direction of the movie and where it went put a perfect pin on the series, and I wouldn't change a single thing about it. I really loved it, but I know that's going to be probably like the divisive part of the movie is going to be that third act for sure. But for me, Maxine is a 10 out of 10. And all I have to say is Maxine Minx is a fucking star.